Inside a sealed federal courtroom, Jasmine Crockett confronts Rupert Murdoch with explosive proof that his empire built profit on lies. As she reveals a private letter and a sealed government report, the world watches the unthinkable. The king of conservative media cornered by the woman he tried to silence. Then Crockett drops the question he can't spin. Do you know what your legacy really is? His answer shakes the room. This isn't just a trial. It's the day truth goes live. But in the end, what did Jasmine say that brought the empire to its knees? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The marble corridor outside hearing room 214 thrummed with anticipation. Reporters packed tightly behind velvet ropes, cameras aimed at the sealed double doors like they were waiting for a verdict. Inside, the air was thick, every seat filled, every screen glowing, every breath held. This wasn't a standard hearing. This was a showdown. The banner above the room read, "Special Hearing on Corporate Media and the Integrity of American Democracy." But the real headline was simpler. Rupert Murdoch versus Jasmine Crockett. When the doors finally opened, silence hit like a punch. Murdoch stepped in, flanked by lawyers, walking with calm authority and the kind of smirk that only comes from decades of unchecked power. His presence alone seemed to drain the color from the room. He didn't just enter, he claimed the space, scanning the room like it still belonged to him. But this time, he wasn't the one asking the questions. Across the room sat Jasmine Crockett, unmoving. Her suit was sharp, her eyes locked on Murdoch with the precision of a marksman. No laptop, no binder, just a sealed manila folder in front of her, like a detonator. She didn't glance away, didn't acknowledge the cameras. She knew this moment was bigger than sound bites. This was about forcing the empire of misinformation to answer to the truth it buried. Outside, protesters held signs that read, "Democracy is not for sale." Inside, the room braced for impact, because this wasn't just about one man's lies. It was about how many voices they had silenced. And today, Jasmine Crockett was speaking for all of them. The silence didn't end when Rupert Murdoch took his seat. It evolved. From a quiet before the storm into something heavier, something personal. It became the sound of two legacies colliding. On one side sat Murdoch, architect of empires, the man whose headlines could swing elections and whose studios churned fear into profit. On the other, Jasmine Crockett, daughter of the South, forged by injustice, propelled by truth. Their first eye contact was electric, but not theatrical. It wasn't the kind of stare exchanged for the cameras or to score points. It was older than that, deeper. Like two histories recognizing each other as opposing forces. One built systems, the other was here to break them. Murdoch didn't wait long. Leaning back slightly, he adjusted the lapel of his dark, bespoke suit and offered her a smile that had sold wars. His voice was low, but crisp, laced with both contempt and confidence. "I've made presidents," he said without blinking. "And you, Crockett, what exactly have you done? Besides cry about race like it's still 1963? The room didn't gasp, but it recoiled. Committee members shifted in their seats. Aides' fingers hovered above their keyboards. The remark wasn't just offensive, it was calculated. This was Murdoch's playbook. Dismiss, belittle, control the room with arrogance. But what stunned everyone wasn't what he said. It was what Jasmine didn't say. She didn't shoot back. No raised voice. No visible anger. She simply looked at him for a long, measured beat, eyes still, posture untouched. And then, without looking down, she opened the manila folder in front of her. The motion was deliberate, even quiet, but it carried the weight of a gavel strike. The first page was slid forward across the table, perfectly aligned with the mic. In bold type, centered like a verdict, the title read, "A Collapse Engineered, Murdoch and the Machinery of Manipulation." No commentary, no exposition, just the truth, printed and placed like evidence on the battlefield. Murdoch's smirk didn't vanish, but it cracked, just enough for the cameras to catch it. Because that moment wasn't about volume, it wasn't about rage, it was about control. He had entered expecting to dominate the stage like he had done for decades, with his networks, his headlines, his reach. But now he realized this wasn't his stage. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to play the part of another outraged Democrat for Fox News to mock in post-show recaps. She was here to dismantle him, quietly, completely, and in front of the very America he thought he owned. Murdoch's smirk hadn't fully faded, but something behind his eyes had shifted. A flicker of calculation, maybe even caution. Jasmine Crockett could see it, but she didn't acknowledge it. She didn't speak to the man sitting across from her. She spoke to the room, to the millions watching beyond these walls, to the Americans who had lost loved ones to lies, who had watched their neighbors turn against them over conspiracies that crawled from the glow of a television screen into the streets. Her hand hovered above the folder only a moment before she pulled the next sheet free. Clean, precise, and marked with one word at the top in bold: verified internal correspondence. The monitors behind her flickered to life. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The evidence would scream for itself. A timestamp appeared on the screen. October 17th, 2020, 11:34 p.m. An internal message from a senior Fox News producer to network executives read, "We know this voter fraud claim hasn't been substantiated. Legal says we can't confirm it, but if we don't lead with it, we'll lose ground to Newsmax again." Another message followed, this one from an executive vice president. "We're not in the truth business, we're in the ratings business. Push it, hard." Jasmine let the words sit there. No commentary, no dramatic music, just silence. And the stench of something rotten in the foundation of American trust. The camera zoomed in slightly as she lifted her eyes from the folder, gaze steady. "These aren't opinions," she said. "They're orders, top-down decisions to air falsehoods, not because you were misled, but because fear sells better than facts." The murmurs started then. Press, committee aides, even one or two senators exchanging glances. Jasmine didn't look at them. She gestured and the video shifted to footage darker in tone, grainy and low-lit. A behind-the-scenes clip, off-camera, off-script, but painfully real. On screen, a Fox News anchor sat slouched in his chair during a commercial break, rubbing his temples. "I can't say this again," he muttered. "It's not true. We know it's not true." Another voice replied from somewhere off-camera, casual, almost bored. "Then don't think, just read. It's what they want. We've got midterms to win." The clip ended abruptly. No music, no fade-out, just a black screen. And then Jasmine's voice. "This is not a slip-up. It's a business model." She leaned forward, her hands flat on the table, her voice still steady but now layered with something colder. "Resolve. You broadcast lies with full knowledge they were false. You allowed conspiracy theories to fester because you feared a dip in viewership more than a collapse in democracy. And then you stood behind your network while communities burned, while people died, while families were torn apart, because the numbers on your Nielsen chart were more valuable than the truth." The hearing room didn't erupt. It sank. The weight of what had just been shown wasn't explosive. It was corrosive, slow, creeping, irreversible. No one interrupted, not even Murdoch. His fingers, which had gripped the edge of the table earlier, now rested loosely in his lap. His expression didn't betray much, but it no longer radiated control, because for the first time, he wasn't dictating the narrative. He was the headline. The silence after the video ended wasn't just stillness, it was paralysis. Words had been shown, not spoken. Truth had been exposed, not argued. And in that moment, the entire room felt suspended between disbelief and something darker. Recognition. Recognition that the line between misinformation and profit wasn't crossed accidentally. It had been paved, polished, and trafficked by design. Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't lean in. She simply waited, allowing the weight of the evidence to settle like dust on a battlefield. All eyes shifted to Rupert Murdoch. The room expected resistance, a deflection, a denial, anything. But what came next was more chilling than any of those things. Murdoch's expression didn't crack. No sweat beaded his brow, no tremble reached his voice. His face was still, ageless, unreadable, as if sculpted in the image of detachment itself. He adjusted the mic with a single knotted finger, leaned forward slightly, and spoke with the casualness of a man reading from a balance sheet. "I didn't create the appetite," he said. His voice was low, almost bored. "I just served what they were already hungry for." The words hung in the air like smoke in a sealed room. There was no outrage in them, no remorse. Just a shrug dressed as strategy, as if lies were justified by ratings, as if public trust was just another commodity to be sold by the metric ton. Jasmine's eyes didn't waver, but around her the discomfort shifted into something closer to horror. Committee members sat frozen. Staffers glanced up from their notes, unsure if they had actually heard what they thought they'd heard. Murdoch had just confessed, not to wrongdoing, but to intent. Not to a mistake, but to a business model. And in doing so, he had made one thing unmistakably clear. He saw no guilt in it, no cost, no consequence. What Jasmine Crockett faced in that moment wasn't just a powerful man, it was an ideology, one that saw truth not as a responsibility, but as an inconvenience. One that reduced the suffering of millions into market demand. And for a second, just a second, the weight of that reality pressed down with unbearable clarity. Because how do you argue with someone who doesn't deny the damage, only denies that it matters? He had admitted the truth, and it didn't move him. But Jasmine's composure did. Her silence unnerved him in ways the evidence never could. For Rupert Murdoch, silence was either surrender or strategy, and Crockett's silence was neither. It was presence, it was control, and that made her dangerous. So when logic failed to rattle her, he reached for the oldest weapon in the playbook of power. Insult disguised as critique. If he couldn't break her credibility, he would try to reduce her to a caricature, a soundbite that could be replayed on the networks he once commanded. Murdoch's voice shifted. Cool arrogance gave way to thinly veiled contempt. He leaned slightly forward, adjusted his cufflinks, and locked eyes with her across the table. "Let's stop pretending," he said. "You, Congresswoman Crockett, are not a truth teller. You're a product." He let the word hang in the air. A product of cheap education and the politics of victimhood. Your entire career is built on grievance, not governance. The room inhaled sharply, but he didn't pause. "You point fingers. You stoke outrage. You sit here playing savior to communities you keep angry so they keep you in power." Then came the pivot. The screen behind him lit up, not with data, not with policy, but with curated clips, sliced and sharpened for one purpose: humiliation. Footage from protests in Dallas, from town halls where Jasmine had spoken with fire about police violence, housing injustice, institutional bias. Each clip was out of context, robbed of nuance, overlaid with Fox News chirons that screamed, "Radical Democrat rages against America," or "Crockett, system rigged against black people." The audio was manipulated for impact, her voice rising mid-sentence, faces in the crowd blurred, emotion framed as extremism. Murdoch gestured toward the screen like a trial lawyer before a jury. "This is not a leader. This is performance," he said. "You've built your name on division, BLM, race politics, victim narratives. You don't want to fix this country. You want to shame it into submission." His tone didn't spike, but his intent sharpened. He was no longer addressing her. He was addressing the public watching from their living rooms, their phones, their feed loops, reaching through the camera to reignite the fear he had spent decades perfecting. The blow wasn't just personal, it was structural. It was a man born of media power trying to erase a woman born from its consequences, to turn her identity into her liability, to cast her clarity as chaos. And as the smear played out behind her, Jasmine sat still, not because she was unmoved, but because she knew exactly what this was. This wasn't just a challenge, it was a pattern, a script, and for the first time, it was being read out loud in a room where the truth finally had teeth. The room had just been flooded with Murdoch's version of Jasmine Crockett, distorted, decontextualized, and conveniently aligned with every fearful stereotype his empire had profited from for decades. But even as her name was dragged across the screens behind her, even as her voice was twisted into something unrecognizable, Jasmine didn't react the way he wanted. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She didn't defend her character because she knew this wasn't about her. It was about the machine. And machines don't stop because you yell. They stop when you cut their power at the source. With deliberate calm, she reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick document. No fanfare, no drama. Just a quiet, confident placement of 32 pages between her and the man who thought he could define her with a clip. On the front, the official seal of the Federal Trade Commission. She turned it toward the committee, toward the cameras, toward the country. This, she began, her voice firm but unwavering, is not a protest chant. It's not a headline. It's not a soundbite. It's a federal investigation. She opened to the first marked page, a yellow tab sticking out like a loaded chamber. This document, she continued, details how Fox News executives and producers knowingly manipulated video content related to Black communities, editing footage to remove critical context, amplifying moments of conflict, and muting those of resolution. She didn't look at Murdoch when she spoke. She looked at the American people through the lens. They didn't make mistakes. They made choices. Choices that turned pain into profit and truth into rating strategy. She flipped to another page, then read aloud. In one documented instance, footage of a police encounter was edited to exclude verbal de-escalation attempts and peaceful surrender by the suspect. The altered version aired on primetime, leading viewers to believe the incident involved violent resistance. Her hand trembled for just a second, but not from fear. From fury, she refused to let detonate too early. The suspect in that video was 17. His name was Julian Carter. He was unarmed. He complied. But your version, she said, finally turning her gaze back to Murdoch, told millions of Americans he was a threat. The room was no longer just quiet. It was suffocating. Because this wasn't about journalism anymore. It was about consequences. Real lives, real families, real harm. Jasmine didn't pound the table. She didn't need to. The truth she held in her hand carried more weight than any accusation Murdoch had hurled. And in that moment, what she said wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a reckoning. A reminder that when the powerful rewrite reality, it is always the voiceless who bleed. And just as the weight of Julian Carter's name settled like a quiet funeral into the conscience of the room, Jasmine Crockett didn't pause for effect. She didn't let the moment rest, because she understood something that Rupert Murdoch had built his career on manipulating: timing. She knew that truth, when revealed piece by piece, could shake trust. But when truth arrived all at once, raw, personal, undeniable, it could shatter systems. So she did not look at Murdoch when she spoke. She turned to the committee and said, with a steady voice that held both restraint and gravity, "Madam Chair, I call one more witness." That one sentence rearranged the air. The door at the back of the hearing room opened, and a tall, dark-skinned man stepped forward, his posture straight, his eyes tired but unflinching. He wore no network pin, no smug expression, just a charcoal suit and the quiet fury of someone who had seen too much and stayed silent too long. Jasmine gestured toward the seat beside her. "This is Elijah Raines," she said clearly. "He served as a senior segment editor at Fox News for 6 years. He was let go after refusing a directive to manipulate footage of a police shooting involving an unarmed Black father of 3. A flicker of discomfort crossed Murdoch's face. Not fear, but recognition. Elijah sat down, adjusted the microphone, and cleared his throat once. When he spoke, his voice was measured, professional, but laced with something deeper. "I was asked to re-edit the segment," he began. "They told me to cut the part where the officer called for backup, to trim the footage so the suspect looked aggressive. I said no. I was off the story by the next day. By the end of the week, I was gone." The silence that followed was sharper than any scream. Then Jasmine raised a document. It wasn't thick, just 3 stapled pages, but the top was marked with an internal routing code from News Corp editorial command. "This is the email thread," she said, "between Mr. Raines's supervising producers and senior network content directors." She opened to a highlighted section and read aloud. "Do not let this become another Crockett soundbite. Downplay the footage. Cut the mother's statement. Make sure we open with visuals that suggest chaos, not grief. We can't let her types have ammunition." The final line wasn't editorial policy, it was strategy. Urban volatility sells. Calm does not. Jasmine placed the email in front of the committee with quiet finality. This wasn't news curation. It was narrative construction, intended to suppress empathy, to inflame division, and to deny justice the space to breathe. Elijah looked up then, straight at Murdoch, and delivered his final words with the weight of someone who had once believed the system could be fixed from the inside. "I thought I was hired to tell the truth," he said, "but I was being used to engineer perception. And when I refused, they made an example of me." In that moment, the hearing room transformed. No longer a space for performance, it had become a courtroom, not of law, but of legacy. And Rupert Murdoch wasn't just being questioned. He was being confronted by the very people his empire had misrepresented, silenced, and erased. One truth at a time, Jasmine Crockett was dragging the unseen into the light. And now it was not just her voice the world had to reckon with. It was one of Murdoch's own, turned against him. The air inside the hearing room was no longer still. It was suspended. Elijah Raines's testimony had peeled back the curtain on the machine. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. What she had just exposed was the mechanism. What came next was the architect. She stood slowly, the weight of the room shifting with her. No grand gestures, no raised voice, just precision, just truth, sharpened to a point. Her eyes locked onto Murdoch, this time not with restraint, but with the clarity of someone done asking for permission to speak. She raised her hand and pointed, not with aggression, but with intent. Her finger didn't tremble. Her voice didn't waver. "Mr. Murdoch," she began, voice clear and resonant, "why is it that a billionaire from Australia gets to decide how Americans see each other? How we define truth? How we understand our neighbors, our elections, our democracy?" The question didn't echo. It pierced. "You've never lived in the communities your headlines destroy. You've never stood in the grocery store line behind the mother your network called dangerous. You don't live with the fallout. We do." She paused, then held up a folder with the Harvard crest embossed on the front. "This," she said, "is a peer-reviewed study conducted by the Shorenstein Center at Harvard, published just last year. It tracked media consumption habits, political attitudes, and racial bias across more than 10,000 households." She flipped to a highlighted page. Viewers who consumed over 5 hours of Fox News per week were significantly more likely to express racially charged beliefs, fear-based views on immigration, and support for authoritarian policy measures, even when controlling for prior ideology. Her tone was measured but unrelenting. "You didn't just reflect division, you amplified it, you branded it, you broadcast it until it became the common language of fear in this country." She took a step closer to the table, not in aggression, but in resolve. "Your empire didn't just report on America. It rewrote it. It told one group of people that they were under attack and told another that they were invisible. And then you sold ad space between the panic." Her hand came down, firmly but quietly, placing the research on the table in front of him. "What you've built is not journalism. It's a distortion field, one that bends reality until truth can't breathe." The room held its breath, but Jasmine's next words came low and deliberate. "So I'm asking, not as a lawmaker, not even as a witness to this moment, but as an American citizen, how did we let someone who's never pledged allegiance to this country control how millions experience it?" She didn't blink. "And more importantly, why are we still letting you do it now?" In that instant, the cameras zoomed in, not on Murdoch, not on the committee, but on the truth sitting quietly on the desk between them. A study, a question, and a woman who refused to look away. The silence after Jasmine's question wasn't empty. It was trembling. The kind of silence that comes not from confusion, but from confrontation. A question had been asked not just of Rupert Murdoch, but of an entire system. How did a man who never voted here get to shape what Americans fear, who they trust, and who they blame? The Harvard study sat between them like a quiet indictment, peer-reviewed, airtight, impossible to wave away. For a brief moment, the weight of truth hung in the air like a thundercloud waiting to break. And then Murdoch spoke. Not with outrage, not with remorse, but with something colder, something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "I didn't create the hate," he said, voice flat, eyes unmoved. "I only reflected it." The words were soft, but they hit like a steel door slamming shut. It wasn't a defense. It was a declaration, not of innocence, but of detachment. Murdoch wasn't denying the destruction his empire had sown. He was denying it mattered. He leaned back slightly, as if the conversation bored him now, as if pointing a camera at a fire absolved him of lighting the match. "People are angry," he continued, "and we give them what they're already thinking. We don't invent anything. We hold up a mirror. A mirror, that's what he called it. The nightly segments that turned grieving mothers into suspects. The graphics that splashed mugshots across primetime without verdicts. The edited footage, the race-baiting chirons, the relentless us versus them drumbeat that turned neighbor against neighbor. A mirror, as if his network didn't choose the angle, the lighting, the soundtrack, the spin, as if it didn't cut out every frame that showed complexity, humanity, or grace. Jasmine didn't speak, not yet. Around her, staffers shifted in their seats, the gallery gripped with a collective stillness that felt like the edge of a cliff. Murdoch's words had not just exposed a lack of empathy, they revealed something far more dangerous: the belief that responsibility ends where profit begins. He wasn't defending what he'd done. He was redefining it as inevitability, as if racism, division, and fear were natural resources, and he had simply mined them better than anyone else. It was a chilling inversion of logic. A billionaire from another continent, standing in the capital of a fractured nation, declaring that he hadn't broken it. He'd simply held up a mirror to what was already broken. And if that mirror happened to be designed to enrage, to distort, to sell, that wasn't his problem. That was ours. The room had begun to settle again, but not in comfort, in dread. Murdoch's words hung in the air like poison. "I didn't create the hate, I only reflected it." It was a phrase designed to end conversations, to kill accountability, to turn mass manipulation into passive observation. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch, because she knew that behind every one of those deflections lived a deeper truth. The kind of truth that couldn't be scrubbed by press releases or legal spin. And now she was ready to reveal something not even Rupert Murdoch's vast empire could control, a truth that came from within his own bloodline. She stepped back to the table, lifted a thick cream-colored envelope from a separate folder, and paused. The weight of what she held was different. It wasn't another report, it wasn't government data, it was handwritten, and it was personal. She turned toward the committee, her voice quiet but charged with intent. "This," she said, holding up the envelope, "is a private letter. It was never meant for the public. It was written by someone who bore the Murdoch name, but refused the Murdoch legacy." The room stilled. Murdoch's expression, for the first time in hours, shifted, not into fear, but into something close to irritation. Recognition. Jasmine opened the envelope slowly and pulled out a single folded letter. Lined paper, ink smudged slightly on the lower corner. "It's from his granddaughter," she said clearly, "an executive in training at Fox News who walked away from a six-figure future because, in her own words, she could no longer be part of a company that turned truth into a currency." Jasmine unfolded the page and began to read. Her voice didn't waver, but her cadence slowed, giving the words room to land. "I used to believe we were informing the world, but what we were really doing was bending it, one segment, one headline, one image at a time. You told me journalism was about giving people what they needed, but all I saw was us feeding them what made them afraid, not to protect them, to own them." A collective shift moved through the audience like a ripple. Murdoch said nothing. Jasmine kept reading. "You always said the camera doesn't lie, but we taught it to lie better than anyone else. We turned outrage into a product, truth into a trade. I can't carry that. I won't. Not in my name." She lowered the page then, not for effect, but for air. The weight of the words hung heavier than anything shown so far. She turned fully toward Murdoch and stepped forward, the letter still in hand, now held just inches above the desk between them. "This isn't from your critics. This isn't from the left. This is from your own family, from someone raised under your roof, taught to inherit your empire, and instead chose to walk away from it. Her voice sharpened, not with volume, but with clarity. So let me ask you now, Mr. Murdoch, she said, eyes locked on him. When the cameras are off, when the lights go down, when you're no longer the man behind the curtain, do you ever ask yourself what you've truly built? Her hand tightened slightly on the page. Do you know what your legacy is, beyond ratings and headlines and boardroom wins? Do you know what's left behind when the echo chamber fades? Then she raised the letter slightly, letting it catch the glare of the lights above, the blue ink glinting faintly beneath the cameras. Because from where I stand, it's not journalism, it's not leadership, it's not even power, it's fear, it's doubt, it's a country that no longer knows who to trust, because for decades you sold them mirrors painted as windows. The room was silent again, but not in stillness, in reckoning. Jasmine didn't lower the letter. She let it stay there, trembling slightly now in her hand. Not from nerves, but from the force of restraint. You didn't just distort the story, she said, voice softening without losing edge. You made generations afraid to believe in one another. You made neighbors think of each other as threats. You turned difference into danger and truth into theater. Murdoch didn't respond. For the first time, the stillness on his face looked less like control and more like refusal. He didn't blink. He didn't move. But everything around him did. Journalists were scribbling furiously. Phones buzzed in pockets. The hearing room wasn't a chamber anymore. It was a courtroom. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't delivering questions. She was delivering judgment. She folded the letter gently, returned it to the envelope, and placed it face up on the table before him. That is the last voice you never expected to hear, she said, and it's the one you can't spin. The letter was still on the table when the world outside began to move. Slowly at first, then with the violent velocity of something undeniable finally breaking free. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just exposed Rupert Murdoch. She had exposed something larger. A media ecosystem built on engineered fear and profitable distortion, finally called to account not by a rival tycoon or political machine, but by a black congresswoman armed with truth, restraint, and a name no one in that room would ever forget again. And the world noticed. Within hours of the hearing's conclusion, the first hashtags began to appear. Not from verified accounts, not from campaign staff or media pundits, but from students, organizers, first-time viewers who had never watched a congressional hearing in their lives. Murdoch exposed. Truth over ratings. Crockett versus empire. 3 words that ricocheted across the globe like thunder. By midnight, they were trending in 23 countries. By sunrise, they were unavoidable. TikTok edits of Jasmine holding up the letter to Murdoch's face were overlaid with cinematic music. Twitter reposts of her question, "Do you know what you've built?" had racked up tens of millions of views. On YouTube, her full testimony went viral under a simple title, "The Moment the Empire Cracked." But this wasn't just digital applause. It was uprising, and the boardrooms felt it. Inside Fox Corporation's Midtown Manhattan headquarters, the mood was no longer defiant, it was fractured. Emergency calls flooded the upper floors. Shareholder legal teams began circulating internal memos, referencing potential fiduciary violations and reputational damage. The video of Elijah Reigns' testimony was replayed again and again in legal strategy meetings, not for clarity, but to gauge how much worse it might still get. Executives whispered behind closed doors about contingency plans, about liability, about the unspoken fear, what if we really lose the public? That question had never felt real before. Fox had survived everything, from phone hacking scandals in London to billion-dollar settlements in U.S. defamation suits. But this was different, because this wasn't a lawsuit. This was moral indictment. It couldn't be settled quietly. It couldn't be buried under NDAs or diluted in spin, because the messenger wasn't a corporate rival or partisan commentator. It was a woman who looked like the very communities Fox had spent years marginalizing, and this time she had all the receipts. By midday, a coalition of Fox shareholders led by activist investor groups publicly demanded an independent investigation into editorial practices and leadership culture. Reuters, Bloomberg, and the Wall Street Journal, ironically owned by News Corp, published breaking headlines quoting Crockett's question verbatim. How did we let someone who doesn't even vote here define our democracy? The line had gone from hearing transcript to rallying cry. Protesters gathered outside News Corp's New York headquarters, waving signs that read, "Media for the people, not for profit," and "You sold us hate." But the most unexpected movement came not from seasoned activists or watchdog journalists. It came from the young. In dorm rooms and high school classrooms, in coffee shops and on subway platforms, something began to stir. A generation raised on fragmented feeds, finally seeing the mechanics behind their own mistrust. For many, this was the first congressional hearing they had ever streamed. Not because they cared about politics, because they wanted to see the moment someone, anyone, held power to account in a way that actually mattered. And Jasmine delivered. Clips of her standing, holding the handwritten letter from Murdoch's granddaughter, became digital canon overnight. College students reenacted the moment in mock trial clubs. Young journalists posted reaction videos, tears in their eyes, whispering, "This is why I do this." A senior at Howard University posted a thread titled, "Why Jasmine Crockett Just Changed the Game," which amassed over 3 million interactions. In it, she wrote, "We've been told to stay in our lanes, to wait our turn." She didn't. She walked into that room and tore the mask off the most powerful media empire in the world and didn't raise her voice once. Meanwhile, Fox's internal world spiraled. Senior producers began leaking more emails. An anonymous editor posted on Reddit detailing how coverage directives were passed down to frame immigration protests as threats and to deliberately conflate gang activity with Black Lives Matter rallies. Whistleblowers began contacting journalists at The Atlantic, NPR, and CNN, offering documentation of editorial censorship, internal memos discouraging empathetic language, and a system of bonuses tied to viewer engagement volatility, a corporate euphemism for outrage metrics. Rupert Murdoch remained silent. No statement, no interview, no response. And in that silence, America filled in the blanks. The question Jasmine had asked, "Do you know what you built?" became a national conversation, not just about Murdoch, but about all of it, about how stories are chosen, about who gets to speak, about what it costs to tell the truth in a country that often rewards the opposite. Editorials across major newspapers, from the Boston Globe to the Houston Chronicle, echoed a single sentiment: the reckoning is overdue. In schools, media literacy programs saw unprecedented signups. Nonprofits reported a surge in donations earmarked for independent journalism. High school teachers printed Jasmine's closing statement for their civics units. Professors invited her to speak on panels not about policy, but about moral courage. And yet, for all the celebration, Jasmine herself remained grounded. In a brief interview with PBS, she said only this: "This isn't about me, it's about the cost of lies. It's about who pays for them, and it's about how long we're willing to keep letting someone else decide what the truth is." Back in Washington, other members of Congress began proposing formal reviews of media consolidation laws. A bipartisan subcommittee announced an inquiry into political bias in corporate newsrooms. The Murdoch hearing was no longer just a footnote, it was a turning point. And still, amidst all of it, a single image remained frozen in time across countless screens. Jasmine Crockett, standing with her hand outstretched, holding a letter that was never meant to be read, asking a question that couldn't be ignored. A billionaire had built an empire on fear, and a woman with no media backing, no billionaire donors, and no need to shout, had cracked it wide open, with truth. The hearing room did not erupt when the gavel fell. It did not cheer. It did not shout. It breathed, as the final word from the chairwoman echoed, "This hearing is now adjourned." The weight of the past 5 hours pressed into every corner of the chamber, like heat after lightning. There were no applause lines, no standing ovations, just silence, pulled tight like a cord between two figures seated at opposite ends of American history. Jasmine Crockett remained still, her hands resting on the table before her. The manila folder closed now, as if the truth it carried had already been set free. And it had. Across from her, Rupert Murdoch didn't stand immediately. For a man who had shaped presidents, collapsed governments, and whispered into the ears of nations, he now looked impossibly small. He reached for his cane, the same polished black one he'd entered with, but this time his grip took just a second longer to settle. His knuckles, once curled around the levers of global media, were pale with tension. He pressed the cane to the floor, rose slowly and muttered, not to the crowd, not to the cameras, but to himself. "She just taught me something," he whispered, his voice gravel pressed through regret. "You can't control the story forever." It wasn't a confession, it was a realization, and Jasmine heard it. She turned calm and poised, then stepped toward him. Not to strike, not to shame, but to leave him with the one thing he had spent a lifetime avoiding: clarity. Her heels tapped softly against the wood floor as she closed the distance. One beat, two. Then she stopped, not quite at his side, but just within earshot. Her voice was low, razor clean, and devastatingly certain. "You wrote America's story in ink soaked with fear," she said, "but I'll rewrite it in real blood, in real names, in truths that buried mothers and brothers have been screaming for decades. You controlled the narrative. I'm here for the reckoning." Murdoch didn't speak. Couldn't, because no spin could unmake what had just unfolded in front of the world. Jasmine held his gaze a moment longer, not in victory, but in closure. Then she turned away, gathered her folder, and began walking toward the double doors at the back of the room. Not as a politician leaving a hearing, but as a woman walking out of fire with ash on her shoulders and truth in her hands. Behind her, the gallery rose not to follow but to witness. Reporters stared, frozen. Aides clutched tablets with screens still streaming live footage to millions. Committee members sat hollowed out, unsure whether they had just watched a deposition or a paradigm shift. And Murdoch, once untouchable, once invincible, now stood alone. A monarch without a throne, still gripping his cane, still unsure whether the crack beneath his feet was just the floor or the legacy beginning to collapse under its own weight. Outside the hearing room, the hallway had transformed into a gauntlet of flashing lights, microphones, and restless questions. But the moment Jasmine stepped through those doors, the noise didn't hit her. It parted, like the sea before something sacred. She didn't flinch, didn't slow, didn't stop. She kept walking, each step more deliberate than the last, not just away from the Capitol, but towards something bigger, a future not yet written, but now undeniably hers to shape. On every television screen in America, they replayed the last image from inside the chamber. Jasmine Crockett standing alone, eyes forward, a single manila folder clutched like a weapon, as a man who had once defined truth now sat beneath it. And the people didn't just watch, they listened, because in that moment, it wasn't a hearing, it was a reckoning. Outside, the wind had picked up. Across Washington, rain clouds hovered as if even the sky had held its breath for what had just taken place. Down the Capitol steps, Jasmine paused only once, when a young intern ran up behind her, barely 20, shaking with adrenaline and awe. "Ma'am," the girl said breathlessly, I think you changed something today." Jasmine looked at her, really looked, not as a supporter, not as a voter, but as someone from the generation that would inherit everything this empire had distorted. She placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, nodded and said only, "Then make sure it stays changed." No camera caught it, no soundbite carried it, but the moment rippled through every digital feed like a quiet explosion. Across the country, people weren't just reposting her speech. They were translating it, remixing it, turning it into chants at rallies, into questions at classrooms, into demands at boardrooms. That night, the Murdoch stock dipped nearly 9%, not from a lawsuit, not from regulation, from exposure. Inside his penthouse office in New York, aides paced while lawyers drafted what would become a statement released the next morning, filled with the usual language: commitment to transparency, editorial integrity, reflection on recent events. But it wouldn't be enough, not this time, because now the truth had a face, and it didn't wear makeup. It didn't sit behind a news desk. It didn't ask for airtime. It stood on the record and said, "Enough." Somewhere deep inside the Capitol, the lights of room 214 flickered off for the night. The chairs were empty now, the screens dark, but the echo of what had been said, what had been revealed, remained. It would remain long after the last reporter filed their story, long after the networks tried to reshape the narrative, because a woman had walked into that room and didn't just testify. She dismantled, she exposed, she rewrote, and she left not just with her truth intact, but with an entire generation watching and following. The empire had cracked, the lie had been named, and the ink finally had run dry. The storm didn't pass, it deepened. As Jasmine Crockett's closing words echoed across newsrooms, lecture halls, and kitchen tables, the tectonic pressure that had built up beneath the surface of American media for decades finally cracked. The hearing had been the match, but what followed was the fire, and the blaze found its next fuel not in politics, but in court, where lies weren't just immoral, they were actionable. Just 7 days after the congressional hearing, a class action lawsuit that had been quietly building for over a year burst into full public view. Filed on behalf of over 2,300 plaintiffs, including victims of election lies, families misrepresented in protest coverage, and everyday viewers psychologically manipulated by misinformation. The case accused Fox News of knowingly and repeatedly disseminating false information for profit and political gain, with reckless disregard for the truth and human safety. The evidence used in the case? Nearly every file Jasmine Crockett had exposed on national television. Emails from inside Fox showing orders to ignore retractions, internal memos warning against fact-checking for fear of losing viewers, clips where hosts contradicted on-air narratives in private texts, and the smoking gun, statistical proof from the Harvard study connecting Fox's programming to a measurable increase in hate crimes, polarization, and social unrest. The trial moved fast, faster than anyone expected. The evidence wasn't just compelling, it was undeniable. For the first time, a federal judge allowed not just compensatory damages to be considered, but punitive damages on the grounds of systemic media malpractice. The courtroom in Lower Manhattan was flooded with press, legal scholars, and family members of the plaintiffs, many of whom had lost jobs, reputations, even loved ones, as a direct result of false narratives. Some sat holding framed photos of victims whose names had never been cleared. And then came the moment. On day 18 of the trial, after 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. 12 men and women, black, white, Latino, Asian, military veterans, retired teachers, a former Fox viewer among them. They filed in, stone-faced, not a single glance toward the defense table. The judge cleared his throat, silence tightening like a rope around the room. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiffs. There was no sound except the shuffle of paper. Then the final number landed like a bomb. Fox News Corporation is hereby ordered to pay $1.2 billion in damages. Gasps erupted, not from the courtroom gallery, but from across the country. Breaking news banners blasted the figure on every screen. $1.2 billion, the highest financial penalty ever awarded against a news organization in American history. Higher than tobacco settlements, higher than oil spill compensations. A number large enough to matter, large enough to break something open. Fox's lawyers sat frozen, their carefully rehearsed counters evaporating on their lips. Murdoch, notably absent, released no statement. But insiders leaked that the boardroom had descended into chaos. Shareholders began filing their own legal claims. Advertisers, terrified of brand association, began pulling contracts. The Dow dipped. News Corp's valuation plummeted by nearly 14% in under 6 hours. Outside the courthouse, the sidewalk erupted in applause, not from protesters or activists, but from victims. People who had been smeared, mocked, erased. People who had written emails for months begging for retractions that never came. A woman in her 50s who had lost her teaching job after being falsely accused of anti-police hate speech on national television wept openly into the shoulder of her son. "We didn't think anyone would believe us," she said, "and now the truth costs something." Jasmine Crockett wasn't in the courtroom that day. She didn't need to be, but her presence was everywhere, in the legal precedent, in the media coverage, in the voices of the plaintiffs who told reporters, "We filed because she made us believe we could win." That night on the steps of her district office in Texas, Jasmine stood before a sea of microphones, not to gloat, but to ground. Her voice was clear but quiet, not celebratory, resolute. "This isn't a victory," she said. "It's a warning. You cannot use fear as a business model and expect immunity forever. You cannot twist the truth and call it freedom. And you cannot tell the American people who to hate, who to blame, and who to fear, then act surprised when they bleed." She paused, scanning the crowd. Not for the press, but for the people watching from home. People like Julian Carter's mother, Elijah Raines. The millions of Americans fed a distorted image of their own country by men who mistook ratings for reality. "We didn't ask for a war on the media," she continued. "We asked for a media that remembers the difference between freedom of the press and freedom from responsibility." Then she stepped down, not into the arms of security or staffers, but into a crowd of young people waiting by the sidewalk. One girl, maybe 16, held up a cardboard sign. "Journalism or propaganda? Choose." Jasmine nodded once. No smile. Just truth. And the country kept watching. Cable panels exploded that night. Fox News hosts avoided the ruling entirely during primetime. They led instead with crime reports and foreign conflict. But the audience wasn't buying it. Ratings dropped by 34% overnight. Meanwhile, competing outlets began airing extended specials on disinformation, quoting Jasmine's hearing testimony line by line. The New Yorker ran a cover story, "Truth on Trial, the Woman Who Made the Empire Bleed." Pulitzer-nominated columnist Dana Jacobs wrote, "Crockett did more than question a mogul. She stripped the spell of inevitability from a network that believed itself untouchable." On Capitol Hill, the ripple effects turned into political momentum. 3 bipartisan bills were introduced within a week of the ruling: the Media Ethics and Transparency Act, requiring public disclosure of editorial manipulation; the Broadcast Accountability Reform Act, proposing financial penalties tied to verified disinformation; and the Public Trust Doctrine expansion, recognizing media literacy as a constitutional protection in education. And through all of it, Jasmine Crockett kept her tone measured, unmoved by celebrity, unshaken by attention. In an interview with NPR, she was asked if she felt like she had won. Her answer came without hesitation. This was never about winning. This was about breaking the cycle, the one where truth dies quietly and power profits from the silence. In homes across the country, survivors of media distortion exhaled for the first time. They had seen justice, expensive, public, undeniable, and they had seen who delivered it. Not a billionaire, not a media conglomerate, but a congresswoman from Texas with no network at her back and no reason to keep quiet. Just one folder, and the courage to open it. The courtroom had fallen silent, the billion-dollar judgment now inked in legal history. But outside, a different kind of storm was gathering. It didn't roar with protest or rage. It surged with recognition. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just exposed a media empire or forced accountability from the untouchable. She had awakened something deeper, the long-dormant belief that truth, in the hands of the right person, could still matter. That one voice, sharpened by injustice and armed with evidence, could rupture the foundations of an empire designed to silence millions. And from that moment forward, Jasmine wasn't just a name, she became a symbol. Within 48 hours of the verdict, bookstores across the country reported record-breaking pre-orders for a newly announced memoir, The Hearing That Shook the Empire. Written entirely by Jasmine, with no ghostwriter and no PR filters, it was a first-hand account of the 5 months leading up to the hearing, from the night she first opened the folder of leaked internal Fox emails, to the moment she stood in front of Rupert Murdoch and held up a letter written by his own granddaughter. The prose was not poetic, it was surgical, unapologetic, brutally clear. "They didn't just twist the truth," she wrote. "They manufactured it, packaged it, sold it between ads for pharmaceutical fear and gold bullion paranoia. And then they blamed the people who bled." The book sold over 700,000 copies in its first week. It topped the New York Times, Washington Post, and USA Today bestseller lists simultaneously. A rare feat for a political memoir, even rarer for a sitting congresswoman without a presidential campaign or media contract behind her. College classrooms assigned it. Libraries ran out of stock. Readers lined up for hours at signings, not just to meet her, but to say thank you. But Jasmine refused to let the moment become performance. She declined interviews with entertainment outlets. She turned down offers from HBO and Netflix. She refused every corporate sponsorship that tried to capitalize on her name. When a luxury car company offered her an endorsement deal framed as a partnership for truth, her response was 5 words. Truth doesn't ride on chrome. Instead, she returned to Texas, to her district, to the people who had sent her to Washington not to climb, but to fight. She held town halls in small churches and civic centers, where she read passages from the book out loud and asked elders in the crowd how they'd seen their own lives twisted by headlines they never wrote. And still the country watched. At Howard University, a wall-length mural was painted of Jasmine standing in front of the Capitol, folder in hand, flames rising behind her. Not destructive flames, but illuminating ones. Beneath it were the words, "She made them look." Across social media, young activists tagged her daily. Crockett doctrine began trending, a tongue-in-cheek phrase that now referred to the belief that public office wasn't just about making laws, but dismantling lies. It was taught in media ethics courses, debated in journalism panels, referenced on cable news by hosts who had once called her unprofessional and combative. And then came the CNN interview. She hadn't planned to take it, but the network had offered her one unfiltered hour, live, no commercials, no edited segments. She agreed only after they promised not to preview questions. On the night of the broadcast, nearly 4.2 million Americans tuned in, some expecting a victory lap, some hoping for mistakes. They got neither. Instead, they watched a woman sit still in front of the country and speak like the weight hadn't left her shoulders, but grown sharper in its clarity. Midway through the interview, the host asked, "You've taken on the most powerful media institution in the world. You've changed the landscape. How do you feel knowing they're still broadcasting tonight?" Jasmine didn't blink. Her answer was quiet, devastating. "He has a news network," she said. "I have the truth. And in the end, the truth goes on air." It was more than a soundbite. It was a turning point. Within 20 minutes, the clip was shared by senators, students, journalists, and organizers across all 50 states. By dawn, it had been translated into 9 languages. Protest banners were printed with that line. Tattoo shops in Austin and Oakland reported clients requesting it across their shoulders, ribs, and wrists. Because in one sentence, Jasmine Crockett had done what no headline could. She reminded the country what truth sounds like when it's not afraid, and she wasn't finished. Following the book's success, Jasmine declined calls to run for Senate or join presidential tickets. Instead, she funneled proceeds into the creation of a national initiative called Truthline, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting local journalists, whistleblowers, and community leaders targeted by misinformation and defamation. Within 6 months, Truthline had over 300 lawyers and investigators, with satellite offices in cities long overlooked by legacy media. Its tagline was simple: "We defend what deserves the mic." At a press conference launching the initiative, Jasmine spoke without podium, without teleprompter. "I'm not here to silence media. I'm here to remind them of their job. If you're afraid of the truth, you're not doing journalism, you're selling anxiety." She didn't just speak to reporters, she looked at them, daring them to hear themselves. Behind the scenes, former staffers from major networks, MSNBC, CNN, even Fox, began contacting her team. Many wanted to testify. Others wanted to join Truthline. The machine was shaking, not collapsing, but cracking, and the cracks were letting in light. Meanwhile, in the political arena, a new class of leaders emerged, citing Jasmine as their reason for running. State representatives, school board candidates, first-time mayors, people who had been told they were too angry, too direct, or too much like Crockett. Now they wore that comparison as armor, and Jasmine? She kept showing up, quiet, precise, unmoved by attention, still carrying the folder, Because what she'd proven wasn't just that power could be challenged. She proved that when the cameras roll and the lights are bright and the system leans hard on silence, truth doesn't need to shout to burn the whole lie down. The spotlight eventually moved on. The cameras dimmed. The trending hashtags faded, replaced by newer stories, newer names. But something remained, something deeper than a headline or a verdict. Jasmine Crockett's story was no longer just about a hearing, a courtroom, or a billion-dollar fall from power. It had become something else entirely, a parable in real time, a test of what this country was willing to believe, and more importantly, what it was willing to change. Because beneath every moment of triumph, every line of sharp truth, there was still the quiet weight of what had been endured. And it is there, in the scars, not the speeches, that the human lesson lives. It would be easy to say this was a victory of good over evil, of one voice defeating a giant, but that would be dishonest. The truth is far more complex. Jasmine didn't walk into that hearing as a hero. She walked in as a woman who had been underestimated, interrupted, edited, and dismissed her entire life. A woman who knew that truth, on its own, is often not enough, that it must be carried, defended, and sometimes shouted until someone finally decides to listen. She faced a system that had long protected those who blurred the line between journalism and propaganda. And she stood not with an army, but with a folder, her name, and the weight of every lie her community had ever been forced to swallow. The lesson is not that one person can fix everything. It's that one person can force everything to look in the mirror. Jasmine didn't dismantle Fox News in a single sentence. What she did was something rarer. She disrupted the comfort. She made those in power uncomfortable with their own narratives. She made viewers confront the idea that their nightly dose of certainty may have been carefully engineered fear. And she reminded the forgotten, the misquoted, the misrepresented, the erased, that they are not crazy and they are not alone, that someone sees them. And she did it without shouting. She did it with facts, with fire, and with the kind of composure that only comes from living through the very injustice she was exposing. But there's another layer still, and it's the one no one puts on a billboard: the price. Because this kind of truth-telling comes at a cost. Jasmine had her past dragged across the internet. She received death threats. She had news segments edited to paint her as hostile, aggressive, divisive. She lost donors. She lost allies. She lost sleep. And yet she never lost her voice. The real lesson, then, is not just about courage, it's about endurance. The kind that doesn't flinch when the machine pushes back. The kind that keeps showing up, not for applause, but because silence has never protected the people who look like her. So what are we left with? We're left with a choice: to accept that the truth can be bent into entertainment, or to fight to keep it whole, to allow those with money and microphones to dictate our fears, or to demand that truth, no matter how uncomfortable, gets the last word. We're left with the reality that democracy does not fail in explosions. It fails in whispers, in headlines that lie by omission, in the quiet normalization of deception for profit. And we're left with Jasmine Crockett, a living reminder that history is not always written by the powerful. Sometimes it's rewritten by the persistent. Her final words in that CNN interview weren't just a mic drop, they were a manifesto. He has a network, I have the truth, and in the end, the truth goes on air. That is the lesson, not that the truth wins easily, but that when it does, it changes everything. And it doesn't ask for permission. It demands to be heard. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.